Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, has warned the British government that it needs to take withdrawal talks seriously. Mr Barnier said he was concerned about British ambiguity on key issues like the Brexit divorce bill. But the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, insisted the UK's positions in the third round of talks in Brussels were sufficiently detailed. Jane Dodge reports.
Once again, the EU has in effect told Britain you can't have your cake and eat it too. It insists 3 issues have to be sorted before talks on trade can begin. It's already called on Britain to be flexible and imaginative. Today, David Davis had a similar request for the EU.
Our goal remains the same. We want to agree a deal that works in the best interests of both the European Union and the United Kingdom, and people and businesses right across Europe. And we're ready to roll up our sleeves and get down to work again once more.
Keen to show it had already rolled its sleeves up, a leading member of the EU Brexit team tweeted this morning. The British government has issued a recent flurry of position papers, but Michel Barnier says he's concerned at the lack of progress.
We must start negotiating seriously. We need UK papers that are clear in order to have constructive negotiations.
5 months on and we're still only at phase 1 of this process. We haven't even sorted out what the ingredients are, let alone baked the cake. And as far as the EU is concerned, there's been a deafening silence about how much Britain is prepared to pay.
It's this divorce bill that's the main sticking point. The EU supposedly wants at least £54 billion. Britain is reportedly willing to pay much less, more like £36 billion. Then there's citizens' rights. The EU wants the European Court of Justice to be the guarantor of EU residents' rights. The British says no way. And the third issue is the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. The British talk of an invisible border is dismissed as magical thinking.
Well, on that idea of leaving the customs union and yet coming back in and writing your own terms, I've described that as, wanting to have your cake and eat ours. But I think all of us have to be a little bit anxious about the time.
Both sides have until the October summit to make sufficient progress. Otherwise, there's a chance there could be no cake to eat at all.
President of the European Commission has hit out at the UK's Brexit negotiators, saying there are many issues which still need to be addressed.
I did read with the requisite attention all the papers produced by Her Majesty's government, but none of those are in fact satisfactory. There are still an enormous amount of issues that need to be settled. We need to be crystal clear that there will be no negotiations, particularly on trade between the UK and the EU, before all these issues, that is to say, those under Article 50, are resolved.
Joining us now from Brussels is our Europe correspondent, Mark Stone. Hello to you, Mark. In other words, come on, UK, get your act together.
Yes, we've heard it before. It feels a bit like Groundhog Day or Groundhog Week here. In a sense, they are no further forward on those 3 key issues, the 3 settlement issues, the divorce issues, the financial settlement, the bill, how much does Britain owe, how much should it be paying, the Northern Irish border, such a difficult issue, and citizens' rights. I've spoken to the umbrella organisation who are sticking up for Brits abroad, who live abroad, and Europeans who live in the UK, who say that very little progress has been made on any side, which I guess is why we are now being briefed by British government officials. Some of the detail as they see it. Cordial meetings is how they are describing the day's negotiations. They reckon that by the end of this week, a total of 55 hours will have been spent by more than 100 British negotiators and presumably a similar number of European negotiators in 5 separate rooms in the European Commission building, hammering out these different issues. This is the third week of negotiations in as many months, 1 week every month. And the British side are keen to stress that they would like to up the tempo. They'd like to see more days of negotiations taking place, and they are telling their European counterparts as much. You get the sense that the British are really now feeling they're in a hurry. They want to get things underway. They want to get the two sides aligned, and they are not at all aligned at the moment. And the key sticking point is this idea of sequencing. The Brits are quite clear, with some justification, I would say, that it is impossible to for example, deal with the Northern Ireland issue, define what the Northern Irish border will look like if you do not know what the future arrangements are between Britain outside the EU and the remaining members of the EU. The EU says we're not going to discuss those future relationships until you deal with those three settlement issues, including the Northern Irish border. It's a catch-22. The two sides are tetchy at the moment. A week of negotiations is underway. Mr Davis will be back here tomorrow night and will update us on progress on Thursday.
OK, for now, thank you.
The President of the European Council regretted today that an enormous number of issues still need to be sorted out over Brexit. Jean-Claude Juncker also said that Britain's stated positions on the Irish border and the divorce bill are not satisfactory. Well, our political correspondent Paul Brand is live in Westminster. So, Paul, more concerns about that lack of progress?
Yeah, Alistair, the Prime Minister's spokesperson said today that Britain is in a good position, that this latest round of Brexit talks just require a bit of imagination. The problem is the EU thinks there is too much imagination in these Brexit papers the government's been producing over the summer. And today, the European Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker, basically the guy who's in charge of Brexit negotiations for the EU, said these papers are not satisfactory, that there are still an enormous amount of issues to be settled. Yesterday, his chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, said basically the same thing. Brexiteers are arguing that, it's not up to the EU to mark Britain's homework, but they do need to think that we've passed the test when it comes to the Irish border, EU citizens' rights, the amount of money we should pay when we leave the EU before the EU will move on to talking about trade, which is what Britain really wants to happen before October. I understand that today the big focus has been on a presentation by Britain saying we shouldn't pay a big sum when we leave. Britain's calling for flexibility, but the EU's not known for that.
Paul, thank you.
Well, as we saw, Theresa May is in Japan as the North Korean crisis unfolds, and not surprisingly, it's high on the agenda in her talks with the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. But the main purpose of Mrs May's three-day visit is to pave the way for a trade deal with Japan after Britain leaves the EU. Japanese firms based in the UK employ about 140,000 people. Our political correspondent Ben Wright has travelled with the Prime Minister, and his report contains flashing images.
A soft landing is what Theresa May is promising on this, her first trip to Japan as Prime Minister. Wearing the colours of the country's flag, this visit is a reminder that Brexit is not just about fractious talks in Brussels, it's about reassuring long-standing allies and investors to Britain beyond the EU. And few are as important as this.
Well, I'm going to be talking to my Japanese counterpart, Prime Minister Abe, this week about the future relationship between the United Kingdom and Japan, about how we can build on what is already a good, strong relationship, but build on that in the areas of security, defence and, yes, trade, and look to the arrangements that we can put in place when we've left the European Union.
Japan wants the unpolished truth from Theresa May about how she sees Britain's new relationship with the EU working out. But there is much beyond tea Japan and Britain have in common, and the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has also indicated his readiness to do a new trade deal with the UK after we've left the EU. Theresa May is keen to convey the UK's respect for Japan during this three-day visit to a country that's the world's third largest economy and has been for 3 decades a huge investor in Britain, from car plants through manufacturing and banking. Japan has also really valued the UK's position as a gateway into EU markets, and now there is real concern here about the disruption that Brexit could bring. Some of Japan's banks, for instance, are worried their access to EU markets could suffer if Brexit backfires.
Some financial institutions have announced that they prepare moving a certain number of operations and jobs from London to the European continent to obtain the single passport within the EU. This is not good for the UK.
What's in the Japanese minds at the moment is the relationship between the UK and the EU. They are watching the progress of Brexit negotiations nervously.
Now, number 10 points out that Japan-owned SoftBank has committed to the UK after Brexit. Nissan and Toyota have upped their investments too. But Japanese companies fear a Brexit that breaks down without a deal. Do you still think that no deal is better than a bad deal? We could still walk away.
Yes, I think that is right. But if you talk about the point at which we leave the European Union, we want to ensure that at that point we do have a deal, and that we have a deal that is the right deal for the United Kingdom.
After a day in Japan's former imperial capital, Kyoto, Theresa May boarded a bullet train to its new one, Tokyo. Questions from her host about how the government plans to turn Brexit rhetoric into reality will follow the Prime Minister there. Ben Wright, BBC News, Kyoto.
Brexit talks are underway again, and one of the key issues negotiators are grappling with is what to do about the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, which will remain in the EU. When it comes to the locks that separate the two countries, the argument about where the border falls has been running for nearly 100 years. Our Ireland correspondent Chris Buckler reports now from the border at Carlingford Lough.
These waters are becoming even more of a dividing line. The shore on the southern side of this loch will remain part of the European Union. The other is on its way out. And for fishermen leaving ports in both Northern Ireland and the Republic, that will have an impact. The UK has already announced that it's ending one arrangement that allows other countries to fish in its waters. And many fishermen believe that Brexit could offer new opportunities because they could be freed from EU fishing quotas. But trading deals and other agreements have still to be negotiated.
When Brexit comes, there may be a situation where if you're a northern registered boat, you will not be able to fish in the south side of the loch. If you're a southern registered boat, you may not be able to fish in the northern side of the loch. So where does that leave us?
The border on land might be agreed, but that's not the case on the water. The British government has insisted it owns all of Lough Foyle on the north coast, but that's fiercely disputed by ministers in Dublin. And here on Carlingford Lough, there are some competing jurisdictional claims too.
It's almost a century since the Republic of Ireland was formed, but it's still a matter of dispute who got what in that divorce. Perhaps it mattered a little less whenever both the UK and Ireland were inside the European Union. But with a Brexit breakup coming, those issues could be important again.
In places like Warren Point, people have become very used to living without any sign of borders. And in their recently published proposals, the British government made clear that it doesn't want that to change. EU leaders share that desire, but they have concerns about how practically that's possible if the UK is outside of the customs union. From this point, negotiations are expected to heat up, but until there is some agreement on issues like the border, there will continue to be a certain uncertainty here.
Just being so close to the border, a lot of people travel to the south every day for work, so if they're putting the border back up, it's going to be mayhem, isn't it?
Oh, well, it does worry me because my son is in farming, and I think with the Brexit there's going to be a big changes there for the farming community.
But the UK believes it has started to plot a course for Brexit in its published proposals. And while that will mean change, here at the Irish and what will be the EU border, they're encouraging people to see opportunity. Chris Buckler, BBC News, Warren Point.
Pound shop Bismarck.
Oh, is that actually the Brexit? Oh, that's the Brexit story. Is it?
It's the big one in the middle.
I'm busy. I'm trying to, because I think I'm going to pull it off by. I need to get it back on. It disappeared from my iPad somehow, magically. There we go. What's this all about?
This is about The View, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who some have even a contender, future leader of the Tory party, although I think that's still rather unlikely. His view on Jean-Claude Juncker, who's the EU Commission President, who expressed some very dark views on Theresa May's Brexit position so far this morning, and by saying that it was effectively a load of rubbish, didn't add up to much, and until she starts writing a big fat cheque, the negotiations are going to go precisely nowhere, and she certainly isn't going to get her trade deal. So Jacob Rees-Mogg takes huge anguish at this and calls what a terrible Freudian slip, calls Jean-Claude Juncker a pound shop Bismarck. Now, my view on what we're going to get an awful lot more of this Brexit talks as the months and even years go on, of effectively abuse heading from one side of the channel to the other, is we all need to take a tiny step back and think, why are the EU Commission, why is Juncker et al. Abusing us at the moment? Is it because we are generally making mistakes in our Brexit positions? Possibly. Or is it more likely that he too has a political audience he's trying to appeal to?
I say he's not even part of the negotiations, is
Well,
he?
he is. He's technically Michel Barnier's boss, who's the chief negotiator. So technically the EU have devolved the negotiation to the EU Commission. So he does have a peripheral, a figurehead role. But what we need to look at is the EU need to make Britain look uncomfortable publicly. Pour encourager les autres, as Voltaire once said. They need the rest of the EU to look at our squealing and our pain going through Brexit, so no one else takes the terrible path of making the same decision. Or certainly that's how Jean-Claude Juncker wanted. So they have to abuse us. I just don't think we should take it quite as seriously as do every time they do.
Well, I think what we could all benefit from is Jacob Rees-Mogg just getting a massive bit of gaffer tape and sort of putting it right across his mouth for the foreseeable future.
What would we possibly do for headlines if he did a thing like that?
In terms, because I just don't...
Headline writers would not be happy with you for saying anything like
I know, but country first, Tom, country first. But
Paper sells second. What?
But I do think that this is like, we're now round 3 of these negotiations. Not a huge amount of progress has been made. The clock is ticking. Nobody has a huge amount of confidence in how the team is doing so far. And it really doesn't help when people like Jacob Rees-Mogg kind of stir things up from the side and make these quite kind of ridiculous, unhelpful, juvenile comments.
Yeah, but isn't Jean-Claude Juncker stirring things up from the side as well? I mean, if he's doing it, why shouldn't we?
Well, that's not exactly the mature way to sort of look at things. And remember, we've got most. Yeah, of course it's good fun. But
the thing is,
we've got most
this
to
is what
lose.
they would say.
We've got.
This is what they do.
But as Tom said
they
earlier,
like having a shout. They want us to look silly. It is all part of the RB. And by rising to it, we kind of end up playing their game.
But also, as Tom said, it's in their interest to make this transition and this negotiation and this eventual deal as sort of difficult as possible. We are the kind of weaker side in the negotiating, so it doesn't help us to give it the big one, like, on the sidelines, when actually we should be going in, being really, really well prepared, really forensic about what we want and really clear about what's going to be the best thing for the country and for jobs and growth.
Giving it the big one? I'm not entirely sure what to do
and
with that one.
apparently taking pills is an appropriate type of language on this. I know what you're saying.
Yeah, you know.
Right, we're going to take a break at
this
that
is
point.
big one.
We'll come up with some good news
I'm not saying that to you.
If you want a cheese sandwich tonight, you're in luck.
I've been getting